When you think about punishment, you might picture a prison cell with bars and concrete walls. But have you ever stopped to consider whether modern incarceration is truly more humane than ancient forms of execution? This question might sound disturbing, but it raises profound moral and philosophical questions that deserve serious examination. If you're interested in exploring dark historical comparisons and controversial ideas about justice, subscribe to this channel for more thought-provoking content. Let's start by understanding what crucifixion actually was in ancient Rome. Crucifixion wasn't simply a quick death. It was one of the most agonizing execution methods ever devised by human civilization. The Roman government reserved this punishment for the worst criminals, slaves, and those deemed enemies of the state. A condemned person would be stripped naked, flogged mercilessly until their back was raw and bleeding, then forced to carry the wooden crossbeam to the execution site. Once at the execution ground, the victim's wrists and feet were nailed to wooden beams. The nails would pierce through bone and tissue, causing immediate excruciating pain. But the real horror of crucifixion came from what happened next. The victim would be left hanging there, sometimes for days, slowly dying from a combination of blood loss, dehydration, and suffocation. As they sagged under their own weight, each breath became harder to take. Eventually, after hours or even days of agony, death would finally come. Historians estimate that crucifixion victims could take anywhere from 6 hours to 3 days to die. Some victims were deliberately kept alive longer through a process where their legs weren't broken immediately. The psychological torment was as brutal as the physical pain. Victims were displayed publicly, often along roadsides, as a warning to others who might consider breaking Roman law. Now let's shift our focus to modern prisons. At first glance, they seem remarkably more civilized. Inmates have beds, however thin they might be. They receive meals, even if they're monotonous and unappetizing. They have access to toilets and washing facilities. There are rules, routines, and a semblance of order. Certainly, nobody is being nailed to a cross or left to die in the hot sun. By any physical measure, modern imprisonment appears far more humane than crucifixion. But here's where the comparison gets genuinely interesting and deeply uncomfortable. While crucifixion was undoubtedly physically excruciating, it was mercifully brief in the scope of a human life. Even the longest crucifixion lasted only a few days. In contrast, modern prisoners can spend decades locked in small cells, separated from society, stripped of autonomy, and subjected to psychological torment that rivals any ancient torture. Consider the psychological impact of modern incarceration. A prisoner serving a 20-year sentence experiences 20 years of confinement. They miss 2 decades of their children's lives. They lose 20 years of freedom, personal development, and connection to the outside world. The psychological literature on long-term incarceration shows devastating effects. Severe depression, anxiety disorders, psychosis, and what researchers call institutionalization. Some inmates become so adapted to prison life that they're unable to function in the outside world, even after their release. The monotony of prison life creates a unique form of psychological torture. Every day is virtually identical to the last. You wake at the same time, eat the same food, follow the same schedule, see the same faces, and stare at the same gray walls. This relentless sameness attacks your mind in ways that are difficult to articulate unless you've experienced it. Many long-term prisoners report that the boredom and lack of stimulation are more damaging than physical hardship. Solitary confinement, which is still used extensively in modern prisons, might be the closest contemporary equivalent to ancient torture. Prisoners locked in solitary can spend 23 hours per day alone in a cell smaller than many bathrooms. They have no human contact, no meaningful activity, and nothing but their own thoughts for company. Research has shown that extended solitary confinement causes severe psychological damage comparable to torture. Inmates report hallucinations, loss of mental coherence, and permanent psychological damage even after release. Violence in modern prisons presents another stark reality that contrasts sharply with the idea of humane treatment. Unlike crucifixion, where the victim is physically isolated, Prison inmates live in close quarters with violent offenders, gang members, and predators. Rape, assault, and murder occur regularly within prison walls. A prisoner might face the threat of violence every single day for years or decades. This constant threat creates a unique form of psychological trauma that builds gradually over time. The deprivation of autonomy in modern prisons is another factor worth examining. In ancient Rome, if you weren't crucified, you were generally free to make your own decisions. But in modern prisons, every aspect of your life is controlled. You're told when to wake, when to eat, when to work, when to exercise, and when to sleep. Your mail is read, your phone calls are monitored. Your movements are tracked. Your privacy is completely eliminated. For many psychologists, this total loss of agency is one of the most damaging aspects of incarceration. When we examine recidivism rates, the evidence becomes even more troubling. Over 70% of released prisoners are rearrested within 5 years. This suggests that modern prisons aren't just failing to rehabilitate, they may actually be making people worse. The system creates criminals rather than reforming them. A person who might have been salvageable enters the system, spends years in a violent, dehumanizing environment, and emerges more damaged, more angry, and more likely to commit crimes again. In this sense, modern prisons perpetuate the cycle of punishment indefinitely. Ancient crucifixion, while horrifically painful, at least served a purpose in the minds of its practitioners. It was meant to be swift punishment that eliminated the criminal. Modern imprisonment, by contrast, often appears to prolong suffering across decades without clear rehabilitative purpose. The prisoner suffers, their family suffers, and society suffers from having non-productive members locked away rather than reintegrated. Let's also consider the economic cost of modern incarceration. The United States spends over $80 billion annually on its prison system. That's money that could go toward education, mental health treatment, or crime prevention. Yet despite this enormous expenditure, prisons remain overcrowded, understaffed, and violent. The resources aren't going toward rehabilitation or humane treatment. They're going toward maintaining control and containment. From a utilitarian perspective, you could argue that this massive investment in long-term suffering produces minimal positive outcomes. The health conditions in many modern prisons would be considered unacceptable in any other context. Medical care is often inadequate. Mental health services are severely limited. Diseases spread rapidly in crowded conditions. Inmates with serious mental illness are often warehoused rather than treated. Some prisons have psychiatric populations that rival small mental hospitals, yet the facilities are equipped for neither security nor treatment. This creates a scenario where vulnerable people are punished for their vulnerability rather than helped. When we examine issues of inequality, the picture becomes even darker. Modern prisons disproportionately house poor people and people of color. This means that the most prolonged, psychologically devastating form of punishment in our society is being applied unequally based on race and class. Someone wealthy enough to afford good legal representation might serve minimal time or avoid prison entirely for the same crime that lands a poor person in prison for decades. This systemic injustice adds another layer of trauma to the already damaging experience of incarceration. We should also consider the family impact. When a person is crucified in ancient Rome, their family suffers the loss, but the suffering is finite. It ends with death. In modern prisons, families experience prolonged suffering. Children grow up without a parent. Spouses become single parents. Financial instability spreads through the family. The trauma ripples across generations. Children of incarcerated parents are significantly more likely to end up in prison themselves, continuing the cycle. The issue of institutional violence brings us back to a comparison with ancient punishment. Ancient crucifixion was violent, certainly, but it was a known, predictable punishment. Modern prison violence is often unexpected, unpredictable, and frequent. A prisoner might be assaulted without warning. Gang violence might suddenly erupt. Disputes over trivial matters can escalate to serious injury or death. This constant, unpredictable threat of violence creates chronic stress that damages physical and mental health in measurable ways. Some might argue that modern prisoners deserve their punishment. But here's the philosophical problem with that argument. If we believe in rehabilitation, then we must acknowledge that warehousing people in violent, dehumanizing conditions makes rehabilitation less likely, not more. If we believe in proportional punishment, then we must ask whether decades of psychological torture, threat of violence, and complete loss of autonomy is proportional to crimes that crucifixion victims committed in minutes. And if we believe in deterrence, the evidence shows that harsh conditions don't actually deter crime effectively. Let's examine the neurological impact of long-term incarceration. Studies using brain imaging have shown that prolonged imprisonment actually changes the structure of the brain. The amygdala, which processes fear and threat, becomes hyperactive. The prefrontal cortex, which handles decision-making and impulse control, shows reduced activity. In essence, long-term prison conditions create neurological damage that makes inmates less capable of functioning in society. They're literally being damaged at a biological level by the prison environment. The sensory deprivation aspect of prison life is another critical factor. Humans are sensory creatures. We need varied stimulation to maintain psychological health. Modern prisons provide minimal sensory input. The same gray walls, the same fluorescent lights, the same recycled air, the same sounds. This sensory poverty contributes to depression, anxiety, and cognitive decline. Some inmates report that their ability to think clearly deteriorates over years of confinement. The intellectual degradation that occurs is irreversible in many cases. When we consider the issue of hope, ancient crucifixion victims at least had the mercy of knowing their suffering would end relatively soon. Modern prisoners, especially those with long sentences, must confront the reality that they have decades of this suffering ahead of them. The psychological weight of that knowledge is crushing. Depression rates among long-term prisoners are extraordinarily high. Suicide rates are multiple times higher than in the general population. For some prisoners, the only way to escape the psychological pain is death. We should also consider what happens to the human spirit in prison. Humans have fundamental needs: autonomy, competence, and connection. Prisons systematically deny all three of these needs. You have no autonomy. Your life is controlled. You have no opportunity to develop competence. Meaningful work is rare. You have minimal connection. Your relationships are restricted and monitored. When these fundamental needs go unmet for years or decades, the human spirit withers. People emerge from long-term incarceration fundamentally damaged in ways that affect their entire lives. The issue of forced labor in prisons adds another troubling dimension. Many prisoners are required to work for minimal or no pay. In some states, the wages are literally a few cents per hour. This is a form of economic exploitation that echoes slavery more than it reflects justice. Prisoners work to maintain the prison system while receiving almost nothing in return. They subsidize their own incarceration for their unpaid or barely paid labor. Let's consider the long-term health consequences. Prisoners age faster than the general population. Years in prison with stress, poor nutrition, lack of exercise, and limited medical care accelerate aging and create chronic health problems. Released prisoners have significantly higher rates of heart disease, diabetes, and other chronic conditions. They have shorter life expectancy. In this sense, imprisonment doesn't just take decades of your life in terms of freedom. It actually shortens your lifespan. The social death that accompanies imprisonment is also worth examining. Even after release, formerly incarcerated people face severe discrimination in employment, housing, education, and social relationships. They're permanently marked by their past. In some ways, the punishment continues indefinitely, even after the prison sentence ends. A person might serve their time and still never fully reintegrate into society because the stigma of incarceration follows them forever. We should also acknowledge the role of systemic cruelty in modern prisons. Some facilities are deliberately designed to be uncomfortable and unpleasant. The logic seems to be that if prison is unpleasant enough, people won't want to return. But this approach ignores the reality that harsh conditions don't effectively deter crime. They merely ensure that when people do return, they return more damaged and more dangerous. It's a system that perpetuates itself. When we examine the issue of mental illness in prisons, the cruelty becomes even more apparent. Many people in prison have serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or severe depression. Rather than receiving treatment, they're often punished for symptoms of their illness. Someone having a psychotic episode might be placed in solitary confinement for being disruptive, which makes their condition worse. It's punishment masquerading as treatment. The lack of purpose in modern imprisonment is also significant. A prisoner might spend 30 years in a cell without any meaningful work, without developing useful skills, without contributing anything productive. The time is simply lost. There's no purpose, no growth, no redemption, just endless days of confinement. This purposelessness is profoundly psychologically damaging in ways that are difficult to quantify, but very real. Considering all of these factors together, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. In many ways, modern long-term imprisonment may be more cruel and damaging than ancient crucifixion. Crucifixion was horrifically painful, certainly, but it was brief. Modern imprisonment is less physically painful, perhaps, but it's prolonged psychological torture that can last decades. The damage it inflicts on the human psyche, the human spirit, and the human brain may be just as severe as any ancient punishment, if not more severe. This doesn't mean we should return to crucifixion or other ancient punishments. Rather, it means we should seriously reconsider our entire approach to criminal justice. We should ask whether warehousing people in dehumanizing conditions actually serves the purposes of justice. We should consider whether rehabilitation, restoration, and reintegration might be more effective and more humane than prolonged confinement. The evidence suggests that countries with shorter sentences, better conditions, and a focus on rehabilitation have lower recidivism rates and safer societies overall. These countries treat imprisonment as a last resort and focus on addressing the underlying causes of crime. They don't torture people for decades. They attempt to rehabilitate them and return them to society as functional members. So as we think about modern prisons versus ancient crucifixion, perhaps the most important question isn't which one is worse. Perhaps the most important question is whether our current system serves any purpose beyond perpetuating suffering. If we truly believe in justice, in humanity, and in the possibility of redemption, then we must do better. We must create systems that punish without destroying, that hold people accountable without damaging them irreparably, and that give people the chance to become better versions of themselves. If you found this analysis thought-provoking, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more explorations of difficult historical and philosophical questions. Now here's a question for you. What do you think justice should actually look like? Should it focus on punishment, rehabilitation, or something else entirely? I genuinely like to know what you think about these challenging questions around criminal justice and human